So since Super Mario 3D World has finally been freed of its entombment as a Wii U exclusive, it's got me again wondering why the game is generally held in lesser regard compared to most of its 3D Mario counterparts, as unlike Sunshine, which has had constant discussion about its quality since its release, there's nothing particularly egregious about 3D World that's kept people talking about it, yet it's still considered to fall short of the others. And since there's been so little discussion throughout the years, and since I haven't really been looking for it, the best I got to work with is the game's Metacritic score and its accompanying reviews. And yeah, I know, Metacritic isn't a perfect source of a game's general consensus, it's still the best we got. And personally, I think when it comes to larger scope products and established series, that often enough it is a reliable measure for an experience's general quality, and more so its worth in its medium, how people perceive its general worth. And that's because 80, 90, 100 plus reviews of something are gonna run the gamut of standpoints and angles at which quality can be denoted. And this is really what Metacritic's purpose is, and the reason so much discussion happens around a game's Metascore is, well, one, it's a tangible, measured topic to work with in a discussion, and people like talking about numbers, but more importantly, two, these scores are a challenge or agreement of an individual's core values that they use to determine their own score or general feelings of an experience, meaning this is where people are comparing what they feel or think about something to a measured consensus. So if anything, it's unlikely for someone to line up perfectly with a Metascore. However, it's likely, highly likely, that a handful of reviews listed will resonate with someone as they share similar sensibilities as to what qualities are important to an experience's worth. But let's get back to talking about 3D World. The game is undeniably the black sheep of the larger scoped 3D games, and could even be considered a glorified spin-off since it's a follow-up to a handheld game. But what it's lacking in familiar and structurally unifying elements like the grander sense of adventure, strongly unifying aesthetic theming, token collecting, and an open structure, whether that be a sandbox or whatever hybrid the Galaxy games exhibit, 3D World trades these elements off for an unmatched presence of gameplay creativity, dynamic style, and simple, straightforward fun, making for a solid, pure, and vigorous experience. You run, you jump, you turn into a cat, and throw your friends off cliffs because there's multiplayer in a goddamn Mario game, which thankfully that feature doesn't affect the single player enjoyment, well, a little bit, and I'll mention that later, but it's not like the game is entirely intended to be played with others. It's just that the multiplayer provides a different kind of chaotic fun when playing with 3 or 4 players, though 2 players is probably the ideal experience for this game. But regardless, all this sounds like a pretty sweet Mario package to me. And also, I find there to be some cool novelty with the game's structure, as while it's familiar compared to the 2D games, it's what you might naturally think a 3D Mario game would have been like when initially transitioning from 2D to 3D. The 3D World is a what-if scenario just 20 years after the fact. But that all said, what is it about 3D World that's kept it from reaching the great heights the considered greats of the series have reached? Well, maybe it's simply because the aforementioned missing elements are the nebulous it factor that afforded the other games to receive such distinguished quality. And also, while I find the structure of 3D World novel, since it does harken to a classic style, it may generally be considered regressive in the eyes of many. And while I could just call the video there because I do think these are the bottom line factors regarding 3D World's perceived quality, I want to dig into why that is, why the game I think is nearly perfect is widely considered not to be so. And to do that, let me start by posing a what-if scenario for you to keep in mind throughout the video, as well as to show where my thought process on all this started. If 3D World were initially the structure and template for 3D Mario games, would an adventure-inclined sandbox 3D Mario game released in 2013 when 3D World did, be held to the level of regard 3D World was? Well, still is. I'll answer what I think would have happened in this scenario to conclude this video, but this question that's really about formative experiences or natural versus nurtured tastes got me thinking about the grander idea of quality, what that really means to people and how exactly we process it, as discussion of like, dislike, good, bad, progressive, derivative, or whatever else is so inherent and nuanced in human beings that it can be difficult to convey these feelings and thoughts properly, that despite an experience's quality being one of the major points of discussion between people, we often don't convey or understand what viewpoints we're approaching the discussion from, which makes communication difficult. So instead of making a video projecting my desires on what would have made Super Mario 3D World a better tailored experience for myself, or what I think and felt would have worked better overall, I want to pick apart the idea of quality to help myself as well as others better understand how we each process, reason, and arbitrate an experience. And to do so, I'm going to be using this scale that I'm calling the Quality Reasoning Scale to plot out and demonstrate how different aspects of an experience are naturally steeped in a ratio of bias to non-bias, as most parts of an experience can only be deemed lesser or greater based on personal or external comparative factors, and that these aspects are going to weigh differently based on the individual. But more specifically, I want to mention what factors, conscious or otherwise, an individual is using in their reasoning to determine an aspect's quality. What exactly is the bias at this part of the scale for this aspect? If any of that sounds unclear, don't worry, I'm honestly a bit confused too, but I think it'll clear up quickly once I start demonstrating my points, and naturally, I'll be using 3D World as a reference point to exemplify and elaborate on the different parts of this scale. So, let's get to it. So typically in arguments, discussion, and criticism, people try to understand and classify their reasons given on a topic as either subjective or objective. This likely sounds familiar. But like with pretty much everything in existence, it's not so simple in that these two classifications are simply the extreme ends, the defining bounds along the scale I want to fill. What's more so is that subjective and objective, as we colloquially or generally use them, are not entirely accurate to what they actually mean. It's mostly there though. Subjective is a complete lack of measured reasoning. It's reasoning and arguing based entirely on a gut feeling or intuition. Then while it's correct that objective is the opposite of subjective in that it's a point or argument that removes personal feelings, it's more accurate to define it as, well, exactly what it says it is. Reasoning or arguing based on something's objectives, goals, and even holisticness, meaning the overall adherence and completeness of something based on its core concepts. So, on the scale, these fall on the extreme ends. I've placed subjective on the left and objective on the right, as objectiveness is typically considered right or correct to be used in arguments, as something's gotta be measured and logical lest people try to argue based on their taste and whims, which is going to result in fighting and probably horrible name-calling. But anyway, the point here is that subjective and objective are interchangeable with bias and non-bias, and that once again, most reasons factoring into an aspect of an experience's quality is not completely objective or subjective, that it's a mix of the two, even if one is favored. Gonna reiterate this a lot, so it's what the video's about. Now you might be thinking, subjectivity has no place in arguments or criticism, which is true to some degree, because as I had already said, something needs to be measured and tangible to create solid common ground in a discussion. But experiences carry a heavy spiritual and conceptual weight with them that matters significantly to someone's perception of an experience. And because of such reasons, it's also what much discussion surrounding something typically focuses on, because we talk about the things that matter to us and get to know others by hearing their takes on such things. So I find the bias inside logistic reasoning to be an important underlying factor to someone's natural digestion and processing of an experience. And I think people would do well to embrace this because basically, we're a monkey. But the point here is that while this scale is meant to help clarify and demonstrate that subjectiveness and objectiveness work in tandem rather than separately, an individual's personal ratio of these two sides can be plotted on here as well. That everyone has a personal mix of how much intuition to observation they naturally use to determine something's quality, or at least that they generally put more stock to one side of the scale over the other. It will change on a case-by-case basis, as personal factors are vast and varied, but I'd say there's an average spot on the scale a person is naturally inclined to rest at, or a range they fall into, and this ratio is likely going to fall somewhere in the middle. Hell, I'd even hope that's where most people fall, as those who rest to the extremes are either insufferable for never listening to measured reasoning, or soulless for lacking a sense of romance and only caring about the tangible aspects of something. If you're unsure if this applies to you or not, then it might. And some moderation and self-awareness may do you some good. But don't worry, you're probably not that guy. Anyway, I just want people to understand that we're human beings and that it's pointless, or better yet, impossible to completely remove ourselves from everything we do, say, and reason. And that the opposite is true as well, and that facts and observations synthesize into and affect our biases as much as our personal whims affect logistics, as we are influenceable creatures. But of course, it all depends on the person. So, as said, as long as we understand where we're generally coming from with a point or topic and properly convey this to the best of our ability, or at least try to, communication becomes much easier and smoother. But moving on, let's start filling out the scale with the different aspects of an experience and talk about what personal bias or measured factors are influencing the quality reasoning of the given aspect, as well as how each part of the scale weighs differently depending on the intent and viewpoint at which quality is being processed. Let's start from the non-biased objective side and move to the left. Well, first of all, in the case of games, objectiveness is generally a measure used regarding a game's polish and completeness, as well as utilization of systems and designs based around the core concepts, as mentioned. In the case of 3D World, I'd say it has few objective issues. It runs magnificently and is polished to a sheen, having few to no discernible bugs. Its mechanics and systems are utilized abundantly, and the aesthetic is unified. Though not entirely, as while the overall art style is cohesive, the aesthetic theme of individual courses themselves rarely match up to their overworld aesthetic theme. Like, it's not all ice levels for the ice world or desert levels for the desert world. But an important note to make with this last point is that even if yes, it's true, the weight of that discrepancy in aesthetic adherence is still going to vary from person to person, even if the point itself is an objective one. Keep that in mind throughout. But before sliding down the scale, anything in a game to do with conveying accurate information to the player and making sure they have been told the rules of play can be considered objective as well. And in the case of 3D World, one of its, ironically, perceivable flaws is that the depth perception from the semi-isometric camera can be difficult to discern at times, frequently leading to what feels like a cheap death. And in a platformer, you want to be able to tell where you're going. And while yes, the main skill involved in the game is someone's capability to properly judge, intuit, and execute on performing the various acrobatics or unique actions needed to platform, in games, people want to feel like it was their fault for failing to do something, not that it was the structure or design of the game at fault. Though people do like projecting their failures onto the game's design, but that's a whole different can of worms. But that all said, this camera design is an accommodation to the multiplayer feature of the game, so there's at least a strong reason for it to be as it is, even if it does affect the single player. Though this was also an issue in 3D World's predecessor, Super Mario 3D Land, so really it's an issue with the designated structure style of the courses. And with that point, we're sliding down the scale. This part of the scale, while still focused on the game itself and its objectives, is where a person's favoritism, ideas, creativity, and expectations formed from the game's core concepts are present in the reasoning. Topics found in this section are broader design aspects and the objectives themselves, meaning the game's balance, overall game design of mechanics, systems, and levels, content delivery and presentation, holism, accomplishment of theming, atmosphere and tone, and finally, most importantly, the overall direction. This is taking higher level concepts and reasoning out their quality based on what a person thinks or feels would work best for an experience based on what its core concepts are. Basically, this is someone armchairing how they would have directed or designed things differently, or ideally, praising and agreeing with what was delivered, as that probably means the experience really struck a chord with them. So discussion here is not about what kind of Mario game someone would have liked to make, it's how they would have made a game with the core ideas 3D World harbors. Another way to put it is that this is where leftover desires are discussed, if there are any. Like for example, and minor spoilers for the end of 3D World, I mean like real minor, let's say Bowser didn't do what he does in the final scenario, if you know, you know. A player may have felt the theming wasn't utilized to its fullest potential, and that there was something missing, that there should have been a grander finale reflecting what players are going to remember most from the game, or what the game seems to pride itself on, or simply reiterating a motif or theme found throughout, which in all these cases for 3D World is likely utilization of the cat suit. But this of course depends on the individual and their creative capacities, inclinations to psych themselves up for things, or simply past experiences and tastes, which is really what bias is. But we'll get back to that later, just keep it in mind. I think a good name for this span of the scale is the player experience and execution portion of it. This is where I believe fair criticism occurs, and if you were to be scoring a game, this portion is likely going to be the heaviest factor, but not the most important. That's what comes next. And please keep in mind that while I'll be grouping topics together into sections, this is a gradient scale, meaning topics can span multiple portions of it. Now, before moving into the middle section's topics, I want to make note of how people naturally measure things by comparison, meaning a person's past experiences are crucial to their natural processing of anything, and that while this is a factor across most of the scale except for the extreme ends, this middle portion of the graph is where comparative reasoning occurs the most. So that means we have subjective, or better put, intuitive reasoning on the left, objective, or better put, observed reasoning on the right, and then comparative reasoning in the middle as the heavy mixture of the two. And just to be clear, I'm not grouping the topics here in the middle stretch under the name comparative reasoning like I labeled the last section player experience and execution. It's just that this middle section deals with the in-between of bias and non-bias. I really hope all this makes sense so far, or at the very least, the main idea is clear. So let's continue by talking about the most important part of the scale, the topics that land in the center portion. So, if the right third of the scale is what will determine a game's score, this middle portion is what determines the range the score can land, or the afforded range of quality, that based on the factors to be mentioned, the quality of these determines an experience's potential, because this is where people begin to judge an experience's conceptual, industrial, and artistic merit based on comparative factors and internalized values. Basically, this is where the zeitgeist of a medium starts to take hold. So I think a good label for this third of the scale is impact and appeal. And while things are beginning to get heavily mixed, as long as we're to the right of the dead center, the experience itself is still the main focus. But once shifting to the left side, the experience becomes less of a factor in the reasoning or discussion, even if still pointed at and based around. But we'll get there in a moment. First is what topics and factors fall to the right side of the center. So, if you didn't realize, what's been listed on the scale so far is basically, well, it is, the architecture of a game. But instead of starting top down, we started at the finer, lower level details and have been making our way up to the core concepts that define a game as a whole. So that leaves the four critical topics of features, motifs, theming and subject material, and the high concept to finish off topics involving the experience itself. And to define and exemplify each, since these are important and a bit more nebulous, features are things like multiplayer, platform types, power-ups, courses, playable characters, enemies, you name it. You can think of these as containers for the content. Motifs are unifying or frequently used aesthetic choices in imagery. Obviously, the Mario series has plenty of this to list, but in the case of 3D World, one motif it has is that of cat. Feline. Theming and subject material is the spiritual depth and message of the content. You can think of this as how well does the game or experience touch the player's soul. While 3D World doesn't deal with anything heavy, it is still steeped in positive themes of adventure, whimsy, innocence, and simple good versus evil. In the case of my personal experience, it nailed this as it managed to provide raw joy and feelings of innocence I didn't know could surface anymore. Then there's the high concept, which is the king of all core concepts in the experience as a whole, and it's simply a brief, abstract summary, like a sentence long or two at most, that creates the core spirit and goals of the experience. Typically, this isn't even going to list any gameplay elements or desired genre. For 3D World, it could sound something like this: a whimsical, light, stylish adventure with a classical tinge from the series' origin. You could even add, to be experienced alone or with others, if multiplayer was a forethought for the project. And that's all that's needed. Games start from abstraction that starts from a spark of inspiration that could come from anywhere, and is slowly molded into something whose pieces, ideally, orbit around these core ideas. But to summarize this last portion of the right side, this is where discussion about what a game is becomes absent and transitions into projections of desires. Basically, this is where people start talking theoretically about what kind of Mario game they would have made instead of what was delivered, as well as discussion about the strength of a game's ideas, which is going to be measured differently for everyone, but there are unifying patterns to be found in humans as a whole, as well as individual cultures and societies. Keep that one in mind. So, for the next couple of topics and their placements, I'll admit, I'm not 100% confident in where exactly I want them, especially for what should go in the dead center, as this needs to be something with a near or exactly 50-50 ratio of intuited to observed factors. But I think, and feel, that this is where discussion of an experience's originality, novelty, as well as the general impact it has on the player, its medium, and its industry occurs. As these topics can be talked about both from the lens of an individual expressing how it stacks up to what they know and like, as well as from the perspective of the medium at large. And I do believe this section typically weighs the most when it comes to expressing an experience's quality, as not only in the case of the video game medium is it one of pushing the bounds of technology, ways to play, and storytelling, we as a species naturally take to things that manage to excite, elicit, and inspire us. This isn't to say that people are constantly seeking fresh and comparable experiences. It's just that if they happen upon one and it resonates profoundly, positively or negatively, the perceived value will likely be greatly affected by this. But where the most weight lies will depend on the individual, though I think it's a safe bet to say that the general distribution of weight for the given subject's importance on this scale looks like a bell curve, where the closer to the middle something is, the heavier a factor it becomes to the person. And this does go hand in hand with the idea that an individual's personal ratio is likely going to fall in the middle, as the weight importance of the different topics and aspects is what's determining such a thing. Hope that makes sense. Moving on though, we're finally to the left side of the scale, but keep in mind we're still in the impact and appeal portion of it. There's just a lot to make note of. But on this side, we begin to have discussions on topics where the experience is a secondary factor, even if it is still the base subject being worked with. And also, instead of talking about observed factors influenced by bias, we're now dealing with the opposite, intuited factors influenced by non-bias. Remember, it's all about the ratios. And I apologize if I'm reiterating things too much, but better safe than sorry on a confusing topic and overall discussion. But anyway, to round out the topics of this middle grouping, we have the final dire subjects that people discuss regarding an experience's worth. And hell, I know I just said the dead center typically weighs the most for people, but if this factor is applicable, it may even be the heaviest. In fact, I think it is. And that is discussion involving a person's expectations surrounding an experience, typically meaning how past experiences with other pieces of media in the same series, or even familiarity with the creators and what they've made prior, affect a person's judgment of an experience. Hell, this even stretches further down the scale as experiences of similar kinds, or just in general within the industry, take effect in a person's judgment. Keep this one in mind big time. This video is getting a bit long, so luckily, as you've already seen with the last section, the topics are thinning out. As the farther to the left we go, the more vague and less measurable they become. So there's not much to say about this left-hand portion of the scale, especially since strong personal factors are integral to any reasoning here, which leaves little to no room for discussion. But there is one set of topics that are often a huge factor in reasons given in the discussion of an experience's quality, and that's anything to do with the product side of an experience, if applicable of course, as well as how the experience handles and adheres to major topics within the industrial, societal, or political climate. Now, there is something weird about these topics, as they can be factors involved in the experience itself, like free-to-play games usually have money-related features that do affect the gameplay, or when the subject material of a game's story is reflective of whatever climate it's delivering a message about or basing its content on, meaning contemporary external factors are imbued in the core concepts, most likely in the theming and motifs. And this just goes to show that this system I'm detailing may simply be imperfect, and or that points of discussion can come from many different views, so topics end up falling or stretching to multiple places on the scale. In fact, Most points probably don't fall to a single spot on the line and instead are painted into the spectrum's gradient, spanning whatever stretch is appropriate. Then finally we have the very far left end, which is entirely biased discussion and reasoning based solely on a person's whims and natural tastes. Super Mario 3D World is excellent because I love cats, or it sucks because it's for babies, not mature gamers like myself, or simply, it's good because I like it. Whatever that really means. But we can call this left side grouping of the scale personal and external factoring. So with that all filled out, let's get back to the what if scenario I posed at the beginning and wrap up this video. Now, there were a few things I mentioned to keep in mind as I was going through this, and I wanted to make note of them not only because they're going to help me explain what I think would have happened in the what if scenario, but because I think they're simply the most important factors to any reasons here involving bias. Simply put, how well something resonates with a person's whole being, their tastes, their experiences, what they're influenced by, how their life is going, and an infinite number of other factors are ultimately going to be what determines something's quality for someone. And that large swaths of similar feelings across many players or users or whatever you would call them is going to create a consensus. So then, to answer the posed question from the beginning, if the core structure of 3D World was the base template for 3D Mario games instead of the sandbox type we got, in this timeline at least, would an adventure-inclined sandbox 3D Mario game that released in 2013 as the first of its kind be held in similar regard to how 3D World was and still is? What do you think, Mario?
No.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's a simple reason as to why. A sense of freedom, adventure, place, and discovery is generally something held in high regard when it comes to games, especially in the West. People just like going at their own pace to do things. It's understandable. And please know that I don't dislike or think the sandbox Mario games are atrocities or bad by any means. I did everything in Odyssey and loved it. But even still, 3-4 years out from that game, and 3D World is still the one that stuck to my heart the most. I'm just simply someone who likes tight, controlled, fluffless experiences. I like my doses potent and heavy, and that's what I get from 3D World. But, while I think in this scenario the first of its kind sandbox Mario game would be generally received well, at least in terms of its progressiveness and even evolving and breaking away from a classically confined structure, the formative experiences of a series and genre are critical to how people measure all that comes after. Meaning, there would be some pushback because people would want the thing they're familiar with and know that they like. And hey, guess what? I'd only beaten a 2D Mario game before playing 3D World, so my major formative experience was with the 2D formula, though I think I did touch 64 and Sunshine before eventually playing New Super Mario Bros. On the DS. So the 2D game wasn't first, but this just further lends credence to how I have a natural aversion to sandbox and open world games. And oh my god, the biggest point in favor of that is I can't count the number of times in my life I've had to blow people's minds telling them how I tried to play Ocarina of Time and did not care for it. I had no idea what it was. I just rented it because it had a pretty gold cartridge, played it for a bit, and bounced right off. Oh, what do you mean? Ugh. They all made the same face too. It was so weird. I did try to play it again later in life with the 3DS port of it. Got a bit further than originally, but I still didn't care for it. And now in life, where I can play something if it's designed well enough and has quality of life features, I not only beat Breath of the Wild, but did every shrine as well. Yet I feel nothing in my gut when reminiscing about it. It's just how I'm built. It's just how I am. But my point with this anecdote is that there's always going to be natural factors alongside the nurtured ones in our bias. But anyway, who can really say what would have happened with the posed scenario? Maybe it would have been exactly what people wanted, and that 3D World as we know it when we got it is, as mentioned, simply regressive compared to its counterparts. All there is to it. I know this has been an elaborate roundabout way to answer and point out something simple, but I believe sometimes the obvious needs to be stated for people to realize how unobvious our nature and perceptions of things are. So hopefully you've found this video helpful, and if there's anything you believe was an important part of the scale that I missed, or if there's a better way you think it could work, or if there's an established method I'm unaware of with how it should have worked, please let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will have a video following this one that will actually be about a Mario game and not just loosely based around one, as I want to talk about Bowser's Fury and how fascinating of a test model it is for a potential open world adventure 3D Mario game. I know I just said I'm not into the open world stuff, but, well, see what I have to say. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.